Well, thanks for joining us today for this talk, which we're calling Not Just for Devs, What and Why You Need to Know About Unit Testing. I'm sorry we're not all together today to hang out and to take questions and to discuss this stuff, but you'll see that our Twitter handles are at the bottom of the page, and you can get in touch with us and tell us what you think. Now, it is a bit of a mixed bag, this talk. It's kind of come out organically out of some training that we've done for our admin team here at Design It, and there's going to be some explanation, there's going to be some demonstration, there's going to be some personal experience, and quite a lot of what's just personal opinion about how we work on this platform that we're also interested in. And we're really happy for people to disagree with those opinions, and we'd like to hear what you think. So just to introduce ourselves first, my name's Dorian. I'm a Salesforce developer at a company called Design It, where I've been working on the platform for the last 5 years. Design It is an implementation partner. We specialize in very tricky technical Salesforce projects. We do a lot of custom components. We do a lot of getting stuff on the App Exchange and integrations and that kind of stuff. And this is Angus.
Hi, my name's Angus, and I'm a Salesforce admin at Design It. And like Dorian said, we do a lot of technical projects. I'm a particularly fortunate admin as I get to work with the developers on those projects and have a little window into their world of Salesforce as well. So we'll start off by saying, who is this talk for? And the clues in the title, really. It's not just for devs, and it's not really for an experienced Salesforce developer who would already know about unit tests. So this talk is aimed for admins, and within those admins, ones that work on orgs with clicks and code solutions, as unit tests come hand in hand with code. Ones, as a admin, you're usually the first line support to your users, especially when things go wrong, and unit tests can help you understand what might be going wrong with code in your org. Any admins interested in development and architecture, and unit tests are used in Salesforce, but also other areas of development as well. And with our admin tools, we can build some quite complex and critical processes with our flows, and unit tests can help us make sure that they're working properly.
So why are we talking about this today? The thing is, you probably realize that when you go to conferences like London's Calling, when you go to user groups, people are normally talking about features that are really new, things that there's a bit of a buzz about and people are excited to hear more about. Now, the thing is, there's really nothing new about unit tests. They have been on the Salesforce platform for years. And even really geeky people like myself don't really get that excited about them. But the thing is, they're actually really important. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that unit tests, or more to the point, well-written unit tests, are actually vital to the health of your Salesforce org. And even more than that, they are in fact vital to the well-being of the entire Salesforce ecosystem. So we'll come back to that at the end of the talk and see if you agree. But the thing is, despite how important they are, you won't really see much about them, at least on the admin learning and certification track, where you go to Trailhead and do all that stuff. They're really not mentioned, at least until you get more onto the architect side of things. And that's why we decided to start teaching some of this stuff internally, and it's been really helpful. And the final reason is, I don't like to dwell on negative things here, but any developer on the Salesforce platform is going to tell you stories about working weekends and late nights and tearing their hair out, repairing unit tests that have been broken by some kind of configuration change. And in fact, that happened on the very first Salesforce project I was involved in, where we had to put off our deployment by over a week while we fixed lots of unit tests. And as it turned out, the reason we had to fix them was because someone had gone into the production org and made a whole bunch of fields required. And that small change was enough to break pretty much every test that we've done. Now, I'm not saying that to blame anybody, to shame anyone, because it's really just a communications issue. And what we found is, by sharing some knowledge about this kind of stuff, we can prevent those sort of things from happening. So, it is a pretty big subject. We're only going to have time today for a kind of flyover of what unit testing is all about, but we're going to try and go through some of the big questions that you might have. What do we mean by unit tests? We'll see if we can get a definition together. We'll talk about why specifically we use unit tests on the Salesforce platform when we don't use them everywhere in the IT world. We're going to have a look at where we can go inside our Salesforce org to find unit tests, to run them, to see what they're doing. And we're going to have a look at how they can fail and what we can do about that. But first,
so yeah, as an admin, you might think, why should I care about unit tests? We'll just let the developers do their code stuff and we'll do our declarative stuff and we'll leave them to it. And especially as we have 3 releases a year, all with new functionality and all with changes to the UI and critical updates coming. So we're really busy. And so we're going to need some really good reasons why we should care about unit tests. And the first ones being is our declarative tools are becoming much more powerful. And in the latest Spring 20 release, we can now do things with our flows like before updates to records, just like developers have been doing with their Apex triggers. And we can make some quite fundamental changes to the processes in our org. And because of this, we need to be mindful about how those changes are affecting other things on the org, whether that be declarative stuff that's happened before, or any code on unit tests which is running on the org. Knowing about unit tests is only going to make you a better Salesforce admin, and it helps you communicate with developers whenever you might need to. And if you are interested in Salesforce development, you'll definitely need to know about unit tests. And as we said before, admins need to be detectives. And sometimes when things are going wrong in your org, those error messages that you get from code going wrong can be quite cryptic and difficult to work out. And if you're the developers on your org have been diligent enough to write good unit tests, it's great because you can see if the unit tests are broken and everything might not be okay in your org.
So what are these unit tests that we've been speaking about? Here's a really simple definition that I scraped off of Wikipedia. Automated tests to ensure a section of an application behaves as intended. Just to flesh that out a little bit more, what we're talking about is very small pieces of code that run in the background on your platform. And what they do is they let you know if any of your configuration, any of your customization is not working the way it was originally intended to do. And then you've got a choice about whether you do something about it. Now, there are lots of different methodologies, lots of different ideas about this stuff. It can get a bit academic. But for the most part, if you start looking at unit tests, you're going to find that they break down into 4 pretty sensible building blocks. So let's see what they are. First thing we do is we create some data. This is really important because we don't want to be running tests over live data. If you think about it, you don't have any idea what's going to happen to that data in the future. It might get deleted, or you might find yourself changing it as part of a test for one of your users down the line. So we create our own data and we destroy it later on. The next thing we need to do is we need to invoke. We need to run a piece of functionality. Maybe it's a trigger. Maybe it's a small piece of Apex code. It could be a flow or a process or almost anything else. But we're going to run it and we're going to find out what happens. Once that's taken place, we need to get some results. We're going to check the state of our Salesforce org. Maybe there's some error messages we need to look at. Some data might have been created. We just need to see what's happened. And finally, we're going to do a piece of validation. What we're going to do is we're going to take the results that we were expecting from our functionality. We're going to take the results of what actually happened and compare the two. If there's any difference between them, then something's gone wrong and the test is going to fail. So that's a unit test in a nutshell. But why do we have them on Salesforce? We certainly don't use them in every aspect of development. Certainly in my career, I haven't always used them until I got to working on the Salesforce platform. But there are certain things about the Salesforce architecture that make them necessary. The biggest one is this idea of multi-tenancy. So you probably know that your Salesforce org, although its data and its configuration are sandboxed and only viewable to you, they're sharing resources like disk drive space, like processing power, like memory, on a piece of hardware with many, many other Salesforce orgs. And as far as Salesforce are concerned, it's really kind of rude for us to upload stuff onto that platform that might use an unfair share of those resources. And that's why we have governor limits. Now, I'm sure you all like governor limits as much as we do, which is not at all, but they're necessary. They're necessary, and that means we have to test for them. We have to test that our customizations are in no danger of breaking governor limits and not working. And also, and this comes back to what I said at the beginning about the Salesforce ecosystem, there is a team in Salesforce called the Hammer team. They have one job, which is to run every single unit test in the Salesforce ecosystem before and after a new release. And then they've got a whole bunch of AI machine learning tools to look at the results and try and work out if a new release is going to break anything. And that's why we have this magic number. 75, that means 75 lines out of every 100 lines of Apex code have to be referenced by a test. Now, it's just Apex code we're talking about, not Lightning components, Lightning web components. Flows and processes have got their own deal, which we'll talk about a bit later on. First.
So here we've got a picture of a machine in a Cadbury's factory, and it's a machine that's making Cadbury's cream eggs. And so if you were thinking about testing this piece of machinery, you might think the best way could be to put all your ingredients in at the start, let the machine do its thing, and stand at the end of the conveyor belt and eat the first Cadbury's cream egg that comes off the line and see that the machine's working. And although this would be the most delicious way to test it, it probably wouldn't be the best way. Because we can see in this picture, there's lots of little moving parts to this machine. And this is analogous to most Salesforce solutions. And we need to make sure each of these little moving parts is moving correctly on their own and also working correctly at the scale that they need to make the amount of cream eggs.
So, this isn't really a tutorial about how to do code and how to write Apex. There's some great documentation and talks about that already. But I'm just going to have a little look at a unit test here, mainly so that if, as an admin, you find yourself having to poke around inside one of them and find out why it's not working, that you're going to see where some of those signposts are that we talked about before. So, the first thing is, if you're not familiar with the nomenclature of Apex, a file that contains a number of one or more individual pieces of functionality, we call that a class. And one of those individual pieces of functionality is called the method. And we can see on the slide here that both the class and the method have what we call an annotation, @isTest. Now, don't worry about the ambulance, it's not for us. But we're put by a very busy road here in Bristol that we'll go by in a second. There he goes. And yeah, so the reason we have isTest in there is that tells the Salesforce runtime to sandbox this behavior to make sure that it doesn't interfere with any running of your Salesforce system, and any data that gets created is destroyed afterwards. And here we can see the data creation that we were talking about earlier. Now, we can do this in one of two places. We can do it in what we call a test setup method, and that means that the data is available to every other method in the class. Or we can do it individually within a single class, and then it gets destroyed when that method is over. And then we're actually going to invoke our functionality, in this case by inserting an account that we've created to run the trigger. And if you look out for the test.startTest and test.stopTest, then that's going to show you where your invocation is, and it'll help you figure out what the test is about. And then we're doing a little bit of SOQL. Don't worry about the syntax, but you'll probably see some field names there. We're just pulling in some stuff from the contact object to see what's happened. And finally, there's a validation step. In this case, we use the keyword assert equals, and what that means is we're looking at the number, which is 1, and how many contacts have been created, and we're hoping that they're going to be the same. So hopefully that'll help you a little bit if you have to go and look at an Apex test.
Great, so let's go and run some tests, and we're going to skip over to Salesforce on a screen that's going to be very familiar to most admins, the setup screen. And if we go to home on the setup, and first of all, we'll have a look at where these Apex tests reside. So if we type in Apex into the quick find box, you'll see after a while Apex classes pops up, and if we click on that, we'll see all of the classes in our org, and usually if the developer's done the right thing, there should be test written in the name of that class. So the test will sit in with all the other Apex classes in your org. And if we want to run them to see if these tests are passing, we can go to the home screen and type test in the quick find box and go to Apex test execution. And if we click select tests, we can select the tests we want to run. And we'll notice actually there's only 2 in this list. And if we go to all namespaces, we'll see there's many more tests. And these are all the tests from the managed packages that you might have installed in your org. And these aren't included in the 75% code coverage. And they may well not pass in your org, so we don't need to worry about them as much. We'll be worrying on the my namespace tests. So if we select those tests and click run, we'll see a bit of whirring going on. And hopefully the good sign that you're looking for is 2 green ticks. So we've got 1 there. And we've got 2. Great. So both of these test classes run. And if we click on them, we see all of the methods, the little parts inside of that class, if they've passed or not. And we can see there's 2 methods in this Apex class, and they've both passed down the bottom there.
Okay, so that's what unit tests look like when they're running properly. And by the way, you can probably see from that the whole unit testing ecosystem hasn't had a lot of love from Salesforce in recent times, and it's just a kind of hangover from the pre-Lightning days, but that's not a reason not to use it. Anyway, what happens when unit tests get broken? You might think that it's just a problem for your developer who has to go and fix it, but I'm going to suggest that it's actually a problem for everybody. Have a look at this. This is something that you've probably seen before. It's what happened when a deployment breaks because of a broken unit test. Now, hopefully you're not looking at this and thinking, that never happens to me because I do everything in production. Please don't do that. But you might be looking at that and thinking, well, I work in a sandbox and I deploy my stuff to production, but I stick with the default settings, and that means that the tests never get run. Now, I understand why people do that, because if you've got a mature Salesforce org, it might have hundreds of tests in, maybe even thousands, and running them can take a long time, and that can really stress you out when you're trying to get your stuff onto the platform. But if you don't do it, you never know when things are broken. The other thing that can happen, and I've done this myself, is to take the final option, run specified tests. There have been times, I admit, when I know very well I've got some broken tests in my Salesforce org. I'm planning to go back and fix them sometime real soon, but I just need to get something deployed. So I'll run a few selected tests and come back and fix them later on. The problem with that is, when you finally get around to running all tests and going back to find the things that you thought were broken, you're probably going to find that a whole bunch of other things are broken as well because you haven't been running all the tests. So, broken unit tests can prevent us from deploying, or at least they can prevent us from deploying in a stable and sensible way. Also, they're usually a signifier that we've got some kind of hidden problem, a problem that might not be obvious, but it might be affecting your data, it might be affecting the experience of your users, and we've got to dig it out. That is a time-consuming thing to do. The longer it's been since you've run your tests, the more of a window you have to investigate to find out what's gone wrong. And as we know, development is just an expensive thing to do. Developers are not that easy to come by, they're not that easy to hire, and they often have their time booked out a long way in advance. So it's much better to know about the problems you're going to have up front, and then you can schedule time to get them sorted out.
Great, so let's jump back into the org and break some tests. So we wanted, Dors and I in our org, we wanted all contacts to all have an email address, and there's probably better ways we might have done this, but we decided to create a validation rule. And so you can see in this validation rule, we've got, if the email on the contact is blank, then we're going to stop the record from being saved, and we're going to give an error message back to the user. So we're going to activate this validation rule, and then we can go back to the Apex text execution and run our test again. So we can select those tests, and run them. And as that whirs around, we're going to get a different outcome, and we see 2 red crosses, not a good sign. And so, as before, if we click on one of these classes, we see the 2 methods. And if we view the details where Dorian just clicked there, we see that validation error that we just created coming up here. And that validation has stopped the test data that Dorian had in his Apex test, and then, in fact, made the whole test fail because of that reason. So we've seen that's one way unit tests can fail, validation rules, and that falls into the category of data integrity of the org. And that the same goes for required fields, and even a bit deeper, any lookups you have on filters you have on your lookup fields, or dependent pick lists that you have, can make the test data not work, for example, and make tests fail. So automation that we do can also make tests fail, whether that be just because in certain circumstances the flow or process builder fails anyway, or when many records are being inserted or updated, sometimes flows can break limits themselves and fall over when they're working at large scales, and that can be an issue when in tests. Enabling features, it's so easy to go into the setup menu and with a click of a button enable things like multiple contacts for accounts, person accounts, and multi-currency, etc. And this changes the structure of your org and can inadvertently break your tests. And App Exchange products, and a lot of App Exchange products have their own code, which is put into your org, and that can work with your code in mysterious ways and maybe not how you intended. And we're definitely not saying don't install a App Exchange product, because that would be silly, or do any of these other pieces as well. But what we are saying is it's best to work in a sandbox, and after you make these changes, run your tests, have a look if it has broken any of your unit tests, and then you can be confident about moving those changes into production.
Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of a look at some more code now. Again, not so much as a tutorial about code, but just to give you some things to look for, what I call test smells. These are anti-patterns. These are things that usually signify that a test hasn't necessarily been written that well, and there's something that needs to be changed or rewritten. And here's the first one. So as we mentioned before, we tried to test on entirely sandboxed and created data. But back before about 2012 or so, on the Salesforce platform, we actually did all tests over existing data, over real data. And so they created this annotation called sealed data equals true. So the tests from that era will still run today. But the problem is they're still relying on some pieces of data in the system that may not be there. So if you've got a broken unit test, that's sometimes a really good place to start looking. Now, it used to be the case that you had to do this to test some slightly tricky bits to reach of the Salesforce platform. For example, chatter objects and report objects. But these days, the Apex language is mature enough to not need that kind of chicanery. And so this is usually something that needs to get removed. Here's another thing that we've seen before, unfortunately. What we've got here is the end of a unit test where the validation should be happening. And what somebody's done is they've commented out all of the assert statements. So all of this test is going to do now, it's going to execute, and then it's going to finish, and it's going to report a false positive, if you like, because we're not validating anything. Now, people usually do this because a test is broken for some reason, and they haven't got time to fix it. The problem is, if you do this, the reality is that people never come back and fix them, and tests can stay like this for a long time and mean you've got untested code on your Salesforce org. And finally, this is the one that good developers and Salesforce people get really stressed about. What someone's done here is they're trying to cheat the testing metrics. And they do this by creating a spurious Apex class and a spurious Apex method that does absolutely nothing. All it does is creates a number and continuously adds 1 to that number, hundreds or maybe thousands of times. The next thing they do is they write a test. The test will invoke that piece of Apex, and suddenly you've got hundreds of lines of covered test in your org, thousands of lines maybe. And that means that people can sneak in pieces of Apex that aren't covered at all. And this is a really bad habit. The Salesforce people, especially on the Hammer team, get really angry about it because it gets in the way of their testing. It's not good for your org. It's just not good development, and nobody should be doing this. If any developers that you work with or any Salesforce orgs that you're in contain this pattern, I suggest getting rid of it and writing some proper tests as soon as you can. Okay, so getting away from the code side of things for a second. If you're a Salesforce admin, you might be listening to this and thinking, should we be writing unit tests for flows and processes? Maybe you're already using one of the automated test packages that build UI testing on the Selenium platform. I'm thinking about things like Capado, like AutoRabbit, like Provar. That's a different kind of testing, and it doesn't really do anything for your testing metrics. Unit tests for flows and processes are a bit controversial, but some people do write them. But the answer is, it depends. You have to look at what your situation is, what your organization is like before you make that decision. How critical is the functionality in your flow or your process? Is it something that's going to have a huge effect on your users? Apologies, we've got another siren today. What is the cost going to be to you if that piece of functionality is removed or changed in some way? You've got to add that up. The reason you have to add it up is you're going to need some development skills to write a test. Now, to be fair, there are some packages on the App Exchange that claim to be able to write Apex unit tests in a kind of drag and drop manner. I'm not familiar with them, and also not aware that Salesforce has got any plans to release a project like that onto the standard Salesforce system. So for the most part, you're going to have to be learning some Apex or getting hold of someone who knows it to write a test. But here's the thing. Recently, Salesforce has made it possible to deploy flows and processes in an active state. And if that's something that you need to do, then you have to be aware of this testing metric. It's not quite the same as the one we have for Apex. However, 75% of your auto-launched flows and processes, so not screen flows, and also not previous versions of those flows and processes, have got to be referenced somehow by a test class. And that means 8 out of 10, 75 out of 100 have to be somehow referenced by a test class. And you can look for that by querying the flow test coverage object, and you can do that in the dev console. There's some great documentation about how to do it, so I won't demo it right here. So yeah, you might want to think about flows and processes. But now, just to tie things up a little bit, what we're going to do is recommend some good practice. And these are things that we've developed here over several years on the Salesforce platform. Things that really help us. They help us communicate, they help us keep things tighter with our clients, and they generally help to have fewer problems with tests. So the first thing I'm going to suggest is run your tests, at least your local tests. Run them often. Run them in the background. Run them overnight. It doesn't matter. It's not going to affect the day-to-day running of your org, but it's going to give you a smaller window to investigate if anything goes wrong. The next thing I really recommend is having some kind of strategy for change management. Now, if you're a very large organization with thousands of users, that's probably going to be a bit more intense than if you're a small organization with a handful of users. And you're going to do different things. You might have continuous integration. You might have all sorts of stuff. But you have to have something, and everyone has to agree to it and stick to it as well. And a lot of the problems that we talked about before happened to us because we had sandboxes that were really out of date from production and not catching up on all the changes, the metadata changes, the configuration changes that they should. Now there's a solution to that now, and it's called Salesforce DX. If you get familiar with DX and with version control, you don't have to worry about zombie sandboxes full of stuff that you're not ready to deploy yet. And finally, you've probably noticed this in the org, it's been beta, and I think it's GR now. The Where Is This Used button, which you'll see on fields in the Salesforce UI, really helpful for trying to figure out what is affected by some metadata changes you're about to make. Beneath that, there's something called the Dependency API, which again, you can use from the dev console. Great documentation on that, and that will really help you try and find what's affected by the changes that you're going to make.
So yeah, I'll start with my final thoughts from unit tests. And I found it really empowering as an admin to learn about unit tests and to be running them in my deployments, because I don't, one of the reasons is I, as a non-developer, would find it really difficult to go in and have a look at the code and try and see what it's meant to be doing and what changes might have broken it. But running unit tests allow me to make my changes and have confidence that I haven't broken any of that stuff that I may not readily understand, and that my changes in production are going to work. It's also great if you are interested in development to almost be involved in a platform where you can manage how your changes act with that code without being like directly responsible for the code that's on the platform. So it's been giving me a lot of confidence to go that extra step. How about you, Dawes?
Yeah, well, I'm just going to come back to what I said at the very beginning of this, that unit tests are actually essential for the health of the Salesforce platform in general. Hopefully we've given you some evidence, some arguments for why we feel that way. And I'm going to leave you with a final thought, which is that I think we'd all agree that we work on a platform which is constantly changing. A lot of us work in a business environment which is constantly changing too. Because of that, our own Salesforce orgs are in a constant state of change. Managing all that change is really difficult. And what we found is that the best way to manage a lot of change is to have some things that stay the same. Because when you've got things that stay the same, you can measure the change and you can measure the effects of it. And for us, unit tests are that measurement. They're the thing that stays constant. And I'm going to put it to you that that's a really useful thing for you to know about, and it's going to help you on the Salesforce platform. But please let us know what you think. And you can get in touch with us on Twitter. You've got our handles there. Maybe through the London's Calling website as well. It would be great to see some comments and what you thought about this. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.